The Vikings are far too interesting a subject to make just one or two videos about. You're probably familiar with the latest game in the Assassin's Creed series, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This game generated even more Viking fans today. The word Viking refers to Scandinavian people of the early Middle Ages, who came from different nations, tribes, and countries. How did the Vikings manage to overcome these linguistic and cultural barriers, and later terrorize all of Europe on an unimaginable scale? The Vikings' homeland was Northern Europe, a harsh region that doesn't forgive a mistake twice. But even so, this fascinating story of the Vikings eventually came to an end. Around the year 1066 AD, the Vikings suddenly disappeared from the scene. How could this happen? What were the reasons for it? In the next few minutes, we'll go back 1,000 years, and delve into early medieval Europe. We'll try to discover the true reasons why the Vikings disappeared from the scene of history. Let's get started. Thanks to the Vikings series and the game Assassin's Creed Valhalla, there are now more Viking fans than ever. But history buffs and fans alike keep coming back to the same question. The question, how did the Vikings really live? No, seriously, what was life like for the Vikings? That is 100% true. But the big problem with answering this question is that everything we know about the Vikings today comes either from chronicles of English monks from the early Middle Ages or from Viking sagas and legends. And the most important question in this video is, why did the Vikings disappear? We will refute the legend that they disappeared because they were not real warriors and only attacked weak settlements, thus unable to survive in the long term. Almost everyone knows about the Viking era. The Viking era began in 793 AD and ended in 1066 AD. What many don't know is that there never was a unified Viking state. The koning was a king, and a jarl was a prince. The entire history of the Vikings, and their conquests and plundering, is the history of many different, independent tribes. Yes, these tribes could unite, elect a king, and go on raids as a front of warriors. But no Viking saw themselves as a member of a country in the slightest. The tribes fought each other for power and wealth, kings were elected and deposed, and the Vikings only understood the concept of a unified state from the states they invaded. Most Viking settlements were in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Few Vikings felt like they were part of something even bigger. What was less common, but did occur occasionally, was a Viking state under Canute the Great. Around 1019 AD, Canute became king of Denmark, and in 1030 AD, Canute became king of Norway. Before that, in 1016, Canute conquered England and was proclaimed king there as well. However, in some areas of this great empire, rule could be described as a rule that existed only on paper. In Norway, for example, nothing prevented the Viking tribes and clans from ruling independently in their regions. They could conduct any raids without consulting the king or simply not attend the assemblies convened by Canute. What was interesting, however, is that the concept of the state, which existed only on paper under Canute, was perfectly implemented in practice in England. Even after the Vikings' departure, the English legal system retained some Viking laws, which are still in existence today. Now that we know about Viking politics, let's move on to religion. Thor, Odin, and other gods of Norse mythology are familiar to everyone today. Many movies and video games dramatically portray religious wars between Christians and the pagan Vikings. But that's not entirely true. The Vikings gradually became Christian, at least in Denmark, as early as the middle of the 10th century AD. What's also interesting is that the name Bluetooth is derived from the Danish king Harald Bluetooth. This king united the warring parts of Norway and Denmark. The logo features a monogram of the Old Norse runes like H for Hagalaz and B for Birkenau. And what does Harold Bluetooth have to do with religion, you ask? Yes, because he initiated the Christianization of Scandinavia in Denmark in the mid-10th century AD. The Jelling runestones are two 10th century runestones in Jelling, Jutland. They are the most important stones in Danish history and were erected on the initiative of Kings Gorm and Harold Bluetooth. The inscriptions on these stones describe the Christianization of Denmark and serve as proof. The transition from paganism to Christianity was not a smooth transition and cannot be clearly defined. Likewise, today's public opinion about the Vikings cannot be clearly defined either. Some revere them as brave, strong, and courageous warriors, others as uneducated and stupid barbarians. Yet this discrepancy can be explained quite simply and logically. The great hatred against the Vikings today has its origins in the history of the Church. In their raids, the Vikings deliberately chose churches and monasteries as targets. These contained a great deal of gold and silver, and the priests and monks were little or not guarded. For these reasons, the Vikings loved to rob them. But the irony of the whole thing is that the monks and priests at that time were the only ones who could read and write. For this reason, the monks portrayed the Vikings in a very negative light in the chronicles. For example, they portrayed them as savages and monsters, or even as demons from hell. Yes, robbing monasteries is a terrible act. Yet, for example, the chronicles also attributed the killing of innocent women and children to the Vikings. But the Vikings didn't do this. And not because the Vikings had a moral code, as many Viking fans would claim today. There's a simple explanation for this. Why kill women and children in raids when they could be ransomed or sold at the Scandinavian slave markets? A written record of a monk who survived the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery has been preserved in history. In this letter, the monk described how he would arrange for the ransom payment of children kidnapped by the Vikings. This is logical. It was not uncommon for children to be sent to monasteries to learn to read and write in those times. In addition to this source, there are numerous other sources, and they don't just talk about children. There is a record that in the 9th century AD, the Vikings received a ransom for an old, valuable book written in Latin. These few small facts show that the Vikings calculated everything very cold-bloodedly and profit-oriented, and that contradicts their savage and barbaric image. What if the men, women, and children kidnapped by the Vikings are not suitable for a ransom payment? This is not a problem for the Vikings either. In terms of slavery, they overshadowed the Roman Empire. Some modern historians believe that the slaves from these raids were even more valuable than gold and silver. Slave markets existed in almost every Viking settlement. There is a written record of a priest who visited the Viking town of Hedebo in 870 AD. He was simply shocked by the enormous number of slaves offered for sale, who were kidnapped Christians. Ironically and sadly, this witness account gives rise to another myth about the Vikings, the myth that Vikings were barbarians without equal, who only knew how to fight. As you can guess, the slave economy was an extremely thriving industry among the Vikings. French, Spanish, Byzantine, and even North African traders loved to visit the Viking slave markets. In our video on life as a Viking, we mentioned the Viking colonies in Greenland, Iceland, and Canada. You might think that such colonies would be difficult for barbarians to build, right? Such slave markets and colonies can only be established by a developed civilization such as the Roman Empire, which seeks to expand its trade routes and influence. We already know some key facts about the Vikings. But now it's time to address an important myth. Were the Vikings cowards who were afraid of regular armies and thus lost in open battles? And the second question that needs to be answered, did the Vikings disappear from history because Europe became more civilized around the year 1000? The proponents of the theory that the Vikings were cowards argue that they did not attack Spain, which was powerful in the early Middle Ages, and thus only attacked militarily weak England. These proponents also mention the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 AD. The opponents were the English King Harold II, better known as Harold Godwinson, and the Norwegian King Harald III. In this battle, the Vikings suffered a devastating defeat. For example, those who argue that the Vikings were cowards have a collection of facts that show that the Vikings were incapable of defeating a trained and well-organized army. But opponents of the theory that the Vikings couldn't fight point to the great pagan army that landed in eastern England in 865 AD. This massive Viking army conquered almost all of England by 877 AD. King Ethelwulf's army, which had tried to stop the Vikings from Wessex, was completely destroyed. This English army, like in 1066, included well-organized and highly trained units. Our channel isn't made up of experts in military history, but a simple statistic shows that the Vikings also won many battles in the open field and thus had no fear of regular armies. Otherwise, they couldn't have held England for over 100 years. But why did the Viking era end, and thus the raids, after 1066 AD? As always, the answer is rather boring and quite simple. And to understand this answer, let's review the facts. First, no one defeated or conquered the Vikings. The French, British, Spanish, or Germans didn't land in Scandinavia and thus plague the Vikings. Second, Viking culture wasn't simply erased from history like that of the ancient Egyptians. Ruins still remain today. Third, Scandinavians are still alive today and, according to current ratings, are among the best in the world. But the actual Vikings have disappeared. And that was a key moment. Textbooks explained this with outdated weapons and defeats against the rest of Europe. But in reality, this wasn't the case. The Vikings ended their era because they finally stopped raiding. Their main source of income was slaves and gold. The raids came to an end due to a banal development. In 99% of cases, the discussion is about the development of the Vikings. Two parallel streams developed. In Viking territory, kings and hereditary rulers increasingly consolidated their power. As a result, the general population became increasingly impoverished due to high taxes and the loss of their own land. The population no longer had time for overseas raids because they were busy supporting their families. The second major movement to develop was Christianity. From the mid-10th century AD, more and more churches and monasteries were gradually built in Scandinavia. In addition, castles were built, and regular armies were trained, which were now increasingly united under a single flag and thus could not raid independently. Thus, the inhabitants of Scandinavia could no longer raid, and thus the Viking era ended. But the key fact is that the Vikings left with a proud and honorable style and not through external military force, even largely voluntarily. The idea that the Vikings disappeared because they had outdated weapons, technologies, or were simply unable to defeat a professional army in the open field is just a myth that is not worth believing. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. See you soon, your channel, History Best.